Paris, the 5th of January, 1895. Captain Dreyfus is degraded on the grounds of the École Militaire, his sword broken, his decorations of merit, rank, and unit stripped. In the distance, crowds gather behind the gates, chanting, "Death to the Jew." Standing in close proximity to Dreyfus are the press, including two reporters from the Viennese Neue Freie Presse, who've been covering the affair for several months. Max Nordau and his protege, Theodor Herzl. Both men are Jewish, and though Herzl, like many, is unconvinced by the evidence against Dreyfus, at the moment he is also unconvinced of a case for the captain's innocence. Of far more interest to Herzl is the crowd behind the gates. Captain Dreyfus has been convicted of treason, of spying for a former and potential future enemy state. Yet the crowd isn't chanting "death to the traitor," but "death to the Jew." This in a country where Jews have been emancipated longer than anywhere else in Europe. From this experience, both men come to a realization, like many others in the century past, that equal citizenship is no guarantee of social acceptance. Even in the most enlightened and civilized society, attempting to assimilate is pointless. Whether loved or hated, they will only ever be viewed by the rest of the world as Jews. From this point on, the two reporters begin a journey to recommit to their Jewish roots. But for Herzl, this is easier said than done. Nordau, assimilated though he may be, is still the son of a rabbi, fluent in Hebrew and raised in the Orthodox tradition. Herzl's estrangement from the wider Jewish world is far more drastic, and to understand why, we need to understand Jewish life in Austria and Hungary. While France may get all the glory for emancipating Jews during its first revolution, Austria actually got there first. Between 1781 and 1789, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II issued a series of edicts granting Jews the rights to vote in local elections, acquire land and titles, and serve in the military across most, but not all, lands of the Habsburg monarchy, which carried into Austria's unification in 1804. This enlightened legal treatment was short-lived. Due to the conservative backlash in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, the new Austrian regime of Prince Clemens von Metternich viewed any and all political reforms as a slippery slope to revolution, even when those reforms, like Jewish emancipation, had predated the French Revolution. But don't be mistaken, even without full citizenship, life for Austria's Jews barely changed. The majority had scarcely enjoyed the benefits of emancipation in the first place due to other limitations on the bases of gender, wealth, and social class. And those who had been able to avail themselves of their rights still enjoyed broad social privileges afterward. The medieval ghettos were never restored, Jews who had previously acquired land and titles were allowed to keep them, and they maintained the rights to serve in the military, vote in local elections, and serve in local government. As the memory of the Napoleonic Wars began to fade, and Jewish emancipation returned to the mainstream of European politics, the political and social status of Austrian Jews did begin to fall behind those of other countries. But the myth of Austrian Jewish exceptionalism persisted, fostering both a Jewish embrace of Viennese high culture, even in places far from Vienna, and a proliferation of alternative streams of Judaism, from the modern orthodoxy of Samson Raphael Hirsch to the conservative Judaism of Zacharias Frankel and the increasingly radical reform platform of Abraham Geiger. After a failed attempt during the revolutions of 1848, Jewish emancipation was finally restored in 1867 as part of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. But the difference was almost undetectable to educated middle-class Jews in major cities, including the parents of 7-year-old Theodor Herzl. Though born and raised in Hungary and descended from Sephardic mystics in the Ottoman Empire, Herzl's parents were conservative Musculim and ardent Germanophiles. Exactly the type of well-to-do Jews who were mocked by their Jewish and Gentile neighbors for being more German than the Germans. Accordingly, his father Jakob had given him a confirmation in lieu of a bar mitzvah. While studying law at the University of Vienna, Herzl even became a member of the German nationalist fraternity Albia. Now, I don't mean it to sound like Herzl was completely alienated from his Jewishness. He quickly resigned from Albia due to the fraternity's rampant anti-Semitism, and after abandoning law, he became a very successful playwright mining a deep tradition of Jewish comedy. But he was also part of a society that engaged with Jewishness in a radically different way. Vienna in particular had become insulated from the reawakening of pan-Jewish consciousness that had unfolded to its west and to its east. But by 1880, when Herzl was 20 years old, the cracks had begun to show. At times, he considered conversion to Catholicism as a means of full assimilation, not only for himself, but for the entire upper crust of Viennese Jewish society. And this growing disillusionment, lacking any discernible outlet in his own city, finally found its voice in Paris. While Herzl's career as a playwright was entirely respectable, his parents were never comfortable with it as his only source of income. So out of respect for them, he worked concurrently as a foreign correspondent for the liberal newspaper Neue Freie Presse. In 1894, with the trial of Alfred Dreyfus about to get underway, Herzl was sent to report on the affair with the paper's regular Parisian correspondent, Max Nordau, which brings us back to the start of this video. Like Herzl, Nordau was an assimilated Jewish Germanophile from Hungary. He had even changed his name from Simon Ziedfeld to Max Nordau to sound less Jewish. But unlike Herzl, Nordau hadn't been born into that culture. He had had a very traditional Jewish upbringing and consciously abandoned it, so he didn't quite share Herzl's neurosis. Nevertheless, serving as witnesses to the Dreyfus affair had profoundly reshaped both men's relationships with their Jewishness, and galvanized them to embrace what they had for so long tried to minimize. I hesitate to say that the Dreyfus affair led to their embrace of Zionism. While Herzl would later claim that the Dreyfus affair made him a Zionist, his diaries of the time made no indication of it. Most likely he latched onto the affair later on due to its international notoriety. His true conversion probably came not long after. In the winter of 1895, Herzl returned to find Vienna in crisis. 4 years earlier, a local lawyer named Karl Lueger had formed a new populist and German nationalist political party, the Christian Social Party, with a strong emphasis on anti-Semitic rhetoric. By all indications, Lueger himself was not personally an anti-Semite. He had entered the legal profession through a Jewish mentor and quietly maintained friendships with Jewish figures throughout his career. Rather, he saw himself initially as an advocate for the little people. He was skeptical of economic liberalization and privatized infrastructure, and was critical of an Austrian political system that still gave disproportionate voting power to the aristocracy. But when he tried talking to working-class voters about quality-of-life economic issues, nobody listened. So he began talking about Jews, and they stomped the floor. Upon Herzl's return, the CSP utterly swept Vienna's municipal elections, with sufficient support on the city council to install Lueger as mayor. But thanks to the very political system Lueger was fighting, he couldn't take that position without approval from the Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph I, who bitterly opposed both Lueger's populism and his anti-Semitism. Accordingly, Franz Joseph blocked Lueger from the mayorship for a full 2 years, which only brought more attention and support to the CSP. From that moment, the CSP became Austria's main right-wing party, eventually reorganizing in the 1930s into the Fatherland Front, better known to the rest of the world as the Austro-Fascists. And it's from this that Herzl likely began to formulate his idea of a Jewish state. In May 1895, he returned to Paris to meet with Baron de Hirsch, a railroad magnate who had co-financed the construction of Navon-Bays Railway from Jaffa to Jerusalem, and whose Jewish Colonization Association had been active in supporting new Jewish agricultural communities in the Americas. But when Herzl began to describe his vision, Hirsch was horrified. These were the ramblings of a fool at best and a con man at worst. Baron Edmund de Rothschild wouldn't even allow a meeting to be arranged. You'll note that both men were already active in the Zionist movement themselves, and would continue to be for years more. But they'd have nothing to do with any kind of quixotic independence movement. So if wealthy backers wouldn't bite, Herzl would use his literary skills to rally ordinary people. In February 1896, he repurposed his unused prospectus for Baron de Rothschild into Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state.
We are a people, one people, we have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. It is useless, therefore, for us to be loyal patriots, as were the Huguenots who were forced to emigrate. If we could only be left in peace. But I think we shall not be left in peace.
Der Judenstaat is more nuanced than its introduction lets on. Herzl's thesis is that legal emancipation is no guarantee of social toleration, which can only be achieved through equality through nationhood, etc. And if it seems like I'm rushing through this, it's because you've heard all of this before. Out of its original context, most of the ideas in Der Judenstaat sound hopelessly derivative of Moses Hess's Roman Jerusalem, Leon Pinsker's Auto-Emancipation, Henrietta Zold's A Century of Jewish Thought, and numerous other writings like them. The reason for this is because Herzl had never encountered any of that stuff. The Zionist movement he was describing had already existed for 15 years, and he had no idea. Only after the publication of Der Judenstaat did Herzl become aware of the ongoing First Aliyah. Instead, Herzl was heavily influenced by other nationalist movements, particularly the late Charles Stewart Parnell's movement for Home Rule in Ireland, which by 1895 had risen to become Britain's third largest political party. As a result, many elements unique to Der Judenstaat tended to be wildly out of step with the Zionist movement as it already existed, particularly his dismissal of the Hebrew language. In reality, the first modern generation of native Hebrew speakers had already been born, but again, Herzl was unaware of this. So too did he oppose the use of other Jewish languages like Yiddish and Ladino as ghetto languages. Instead, he envisioned the eventual Jewish state as a Swiss-style linguistic federation. Even as a Zionist, Herzl managed to be an assimilationist. But in spite of his ignorance, Der Judenstaat did identify one core challenge facing Zionism. Jews didn't merely need to immigrate to Palestine, but had to secure a political right to do so, lest the Yishuv continued to exist at the mercy of the Ottoman Sultan. And this is actually Der Judenstaat's primary focus. Herzl proposed the incorporation of a Jewish Ottoman land company that would serve as the de facto pre-independence government. This corporation would exist under Ottoman sovereignty, but would be a protectorate of the United Kingdom, who already held a protectorate over neighboring Egypt, and would operate under British law. This was, of course, absurdly overambitious, but it did plant the seeds of the idea that new communal institutions could serve as the precursor to an independent national government. Now, as I said, only after the publication of Der Judenstaat did Herzl become aware that the Zionist movement he thought he was creating had already existed for years. But that also meant he had a built-in audience. For all the nice things I had to say about Ahad Ha'am in an earlier video, he was still a very technical, analytic guy. His reach was geographically wide, but still very niche and intellectual, and the movement under his leadership had still struggled to animate the masses. They needed a showman, and that was Herzl. So in spite of their differences, the movement flocked to him. Unfortunately for Herzl, the vast majority of Zionists continued to come from the communities of the East. Western Jewish communities still largely abhorred Herzl's ideas, and his proposals to hold a Zionist Congress were angrily rebuffed by the chief rabbis of Vienna and Munich. He could have held the Congress in Zurich, but given that city's reputation as a haven for exiled political extremists, he feared doing so would undermine the movement's respectability. Ultimately, Herzl settled on holding the Congress in Basel, where the Jewish community was large enough to host a visiting delegation, but small enough to appreciate the exposure. So in August of 1897, 208 delegates from at least 14 countries, including some people who weren't even invited, convened in Basel to approve a new declaration of principles for the Zionist movement. 1. The promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. 2. The federation of all Jews into local or general groups according to the laws of the various countries. 3. The strengthening of Jewish feeling and consciousness. And 4. Preparatory steps for the attainment of those governmental grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose. In addition, The Congress also voted to dissolve Chovevei Zion and incorporate it into the new Zionist organization, with Herzl as its president and 3 vice presidents: Samuel Pinellas, leader of the 1882 Folkshani Congress, Abraham Zaltz, former chairman of Chovevei Zion, and Nordau. Finally, the Congress adopted Hatikva as its anthem and declared its intention to establish a people's bank that would serve as the central monetary authority of the Yishuv, though this wouldn't happen for several more years.
Were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it.
Despite the overall consensus of the First Congress, it didn't go without serious criticisms. As expected, the entire movement was condemned by both ultra-Orthodox Haredim, who viewed the Zionist movement as a whole as heresy, and by radical reformers who saw it as a threat to the causes of emancipation and assimilation. But there were also plenty of grievances to be aired from within the movement. The majority of Zionists at this time were of a socialist bent, and yet socialism had enjoyed no official representation at the Congress. In his ignorance of the movement, Herzl had presumed that socialism at large was fundamentally anti-Zionist, but this was incorrect. There had even been some individual socialists at the First Congress, one of whom, Nachman Sirkin, voiced his criticism by outlining the principles of labor Zionism as an implicit challenge to Herzl and his so-called general Zionism. Sirkin was drawing from a tradition that went all the way back to Moses Hess in the 1860s, envisioning Jewish statehood as not only a liberation from the abstraction and self-oppression of Jewish religion, but as the anchor of a renewed Jewish philosophy of social, economic, and environmental justice. So too did Herzl receive criticism from Zionist suffragists. 17 women had been invited as delegates to the First Congress, yet they hadn't been given a vote. Their full inclusion, as well as that of the socialists, would have to be addressed the following year. But the angriest criticism came from Herzl's predecessor as de facto leader of the Zionist movement. Prior to Herzl's arrival on the scene, Ahad Ha'am had been the person responsible for keeping Zionism alive, which he did by getting people out of their comfort zones to acknowledge Palestine as a tangible living place instead of an idealistic fantasy. And yet, here was a man who thought only in idealistic fantasies. And not only that, but a born assimilator, someone of such tenuous and remote Jewishness as to be psychologically incapable of the task he had taken on. Writing in his new Hebrew language newspaper Hashiloach, Ahad Ha'am remained resolute in his support for Zionism as a cultural project and not a political one.
The spirit of our people desires further development. It wants to absorb the basic elements of general culture which are reaching it from the outside world, but the conditions of its life in exile are not suitable for such a task. It does not need an independent state, but only the creation in its native land of conditions favorable to its development. A good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of civilization, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature. When our national culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident that it will produce men in the land of Israel who will be able at a favorable moment to establish a state there, one which will not merely be a state of Jews, but a really Jewish state.
The following August, the Zionist Congress reconvened in Basel. Women delegates were given full voting power, and the Socialist Bloc was formally recognized. In addition, the Zionist organization adopted a flag of Herzl's design. But Ahad Ha'am, who had attended the First Congress, chose not to return, and for the time being, his criticisms would go unaddressed. There was much else to deal with in the new year of 1898. Just as the Dreyfus Affair was fueling France's first wave of pogroms in over a century, so too was Austria experiencing its first wave of pogroms in over a century, led not by German nationalists like the CSP, but by Polish nationalists in Western Galicia. Vienna came down hard on the violence, resulting in 5,000 arrests, and Galician Governor Count Leon Paninsky ordered the dissolution of anti-Semitic political organizations in the region. However, the arch-conservative Paninsky also used the riots as a pretext to crack down on all kinds of groups, including socialists, suffragists, and even some Jewish organizations. Keep in mind, 74% of Austria's Jews lived in Galicia, so while many assimilated Viennese Jews may have been quick to dismiss it, both the riots and Count Paninsky's response did permanent damage to the Jewish community's sense of Austrian exceptionalism. This was a prime moment to bring more attention to the Zionist movement, and by pure coincidence, Herzl spotted a unique opportunity to raise his profile even further. That October, Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany embarked on a tour of Palestine in order to dedicate the new Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in Jerusalem, with Herzl tagging along as part of the press entourage. Germany at this time was a rising power with a very particular interest in strengthening its ties to and presence in the Ottoman Empire. In particular, the construction of a Berlin to Baghdad railway that would provide Germany with access to the Indian Ocean. And to Herzl, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to facilitate his ambitions through this new German-Ottoman cooperation. Perhaps it was Germany, rather than Britain, that could serve as protector over the Yishuv. In Constantinople, Herzl asked the Kaiser directly to lobby Sultan Abdul Hamid in support of the proposed Jewish Ottoman Land Company, which would be backed by Germany and assume the Ottoman government's massive debts. Wilhelm seemed open to this, possibly because he was a casual anti-Semite who viewed Zionism as a way to reduce Germany's Jewish population, undermine his political opponents, bail out the Ottoman economy, and improve Germany's image with the wider Jewish world. Meeting again at the Jewish Agricultural School of Mikveh Yisrael outside Jaffa, the Kaiser informally recognized Herzl as the leader of the Zionist movement. But 4 days later in Jerusalem, Wilhelm informed Herzl that he was no longer interested. For the previous 2 decades, the Sultan had consistently opposed any sizable Jewish immigration to Palestine. And while the government's attempts to restrict it had been poorly crafted, riddled with loopholes, and generally unenforceable, they weren't about to stop trying. Foreign Minister Ahmed Tevfik Pasha had forcefully warned the Kaiser that the Sultan would have nothing to do with Zionism and an independent Jewish kingdom. But while Herzl was no closer to any kind of government support, the fact that he had enjoyed a regular audience with a major European leader at all was a huge confidence boost for the movement. Over the next 3 years, 3 more Zionist congresses were held. The Zionist organization received mandates to establish a Hebrew university in Jerusalem, though this would take decades, as well as a non-profit general fund to buy up land in Palestine for the purposes of both agricultural development and environmental projects, particularly restoring the ancient forests of the Judean mountains, which had been largely destroyed by the Romans following the Bar Kokhba revolt. In addition to the general and labor Zionists, these congresses quickly gave rise to a third faction, as liberal opponents of Herzl, favoring the cultural Zionist program of Achad Ha'am, formed the Democratic Fraction, led by Chaim Weizmann, a professor of biochemistry at the University of Geneva. So too did a fourth faction emerge, the religious Zionists, led by Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Renes. Until now, Zionism had been dominated by people like Herzl, who wasn't religious, or like Sirkin and Achad Ha'am, who actively viewed Zionism as an escape from religion. At the same time, ultra-Orthodox Jewry largely rejected the Zionist project as blasphemous. And while there had been some rabbis in the movement before, their involvement had largely been coincidental to their religious convictions. Renes, on the other hand, was part of the modern Orthodox stream of Judaism. So he was still Orthodox, but he was also still a maskil. And because of that, he was able to support the idea of a secular Jewish state explicitly from a religious perspective. But like the labor Zionists and the Democratic Fraction, they too opposed Herzl on the issue of culture. This had been subtext for a couple of years by this point, but now it was out in the open. Herzl was in the minority in his own movement. Meanwhile, Herzl remained convinced that Zionism could never succeed without the cooperation of the Ottoman Sultan and the establishment of a joint land company. In 1901, he finally met face-to-face with Abdul Hamid, who presented Herzl with the Commander's Cross of the Order of the Mejidi, one of the highest civilian honors in the empire. However, the Sultan had only met with Herzl as a courtesy, on the express condition that Zionism wouldn't be discussed. Ironically, Abdul Hamid came away from the meeting quite liking Herzl, and expressed his openness to further Jewish immigration to the empire at large. He had actually given amnesty to all Jewish immigrants in Palestine earlier that year. But Tevfik Pasha, who had only arranged to award Herzl with the Commander's Cross in the hope that it would make him go away, made no secret of his government's opposition to Zionism at large or any further Jewish immigration in Palestine. He had even tried to ban foreign shipping companies from carrying Jewish passengers, only backing down because it would be a violation of other countries' sovereignty. And having seen the Sultan's surprising warmth toward Herzl, Tevfik Pasha would never allow them to meet again. Herzl himself believed he could strike a deal with the Ottomans if he had the proper financial backing, but it was precisely because of his failures at Constantinople that he'd been unable to attract any large benefactors to the Zionist organization. So in an effort to win over both, he returned to Constantinople in July 1902 with a new proposal. His idea for the Jewish Ottoman Land Company that would oversee Jewish settlement and assume the government's debt remained integral to his plans. But now he suggested that rather than a concession over Palestine, the land company could instead receive concessions at the port of Haifa and in Iraq. At this point, the Berlin to Baghdad Railway was about to begin construction, and there were also plans in the works for a branch line to Haifa as part of the Hejaz Railway. So Herzl's implication was clear. Jewish laborers and engineers could be essential to modernizing and strengthening the empire for the 20th century. To sweeten the deal, Herzl brought a gift for the Sultan, a custom-designed Remington 7 typewriter from the US that was capable of typing in the Arabic script. It was, in fact, the first Arabic typewriter in the world. This was probably the closest that Grand Vizier Mehmed Said Pasha ever came to making a deal with Herzl. But while the proposal ameliorated some of the port's anxieties toward Zionism, it brought new complications. First, the very fact that Haifa was getting a railroad connection made it too valuable to give away as a concession. Even the proposals in Iraq would have required the Ottomans to give up on another proposed economic partnership with France, and nobody was going to choose Theodor Herzl over an actual world power. Foreign Minister Tevfik Pasha, meanwhile, remained staunchly opposed to Herzl. He made sure that the Sultan never received his typewriter, and even championed new laws banning typewriters from the empire. Herzl returned to Vienna disappointed but undeterred. He'd been here before, and just as in 1896, he would use his literary talents to rally the masses.
If you will it, it is no dream. But if you do not will it, it is and will remain a dream, this story that I have told you. All the activity of mankind was a dream once, and will be a dream again.
With Der Judenstaat, Herzl gave the world his Zionist manifesto. Now he sought to show it in action. In the utopian science fiction novel Altneuland, a Viennese Jewish intellectual and a Gentile American aristocrat leave Europe to spend 20 years of isolation in the South Pacific. Returning to civilization in the far-off year of 1923, the two men are shocked to discover that Palestine has been totally reinvented as a thriving, liberal Jewish society, the titular Old New Land. Herzl strongly emphasizes that Altneuland in 1923 remains a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan, but for all intents and purposes, it's presented as an independent country. Haifa is reborn as one of the great industrial and cultural centers of the world, the undisputed leader in technology, science, and fine art. In the political capital Jerusalem, our two protagonists not only find the centers of national power, but a palace of peace, where delegates from every nation gather in a united forum to resolve their disputes and aid peacekeeping efforts around the world. They've chosen Jerusalem as their headquarters because Altneuland is the most peaceful country in the world, established with the consent of every nation and free from conflict external or internal. As the book's only named Arab character explains, Zionism had so massively improved their lives that there was no reason to oppose it. Yet, even if one was to accept Altneuland as a premise, Herzl's idealized Jewish society raised uncomfortable questions. Despite being supposedly classless and egalitarian, Alt-Neuland is an extremely formal society, full of white gloves and top hats, where the main form of entertainment is opera, and the national language is German. Socialism is virtually non-existent in Alt-Neuland. Instead, politics is dominated by aggressive liberal capitalism. Hardly any Jews live outside of a handful of large cities. Hebrew is virtually unknown in Herzl's utopia, and ancient Jewish sites are neglected and forgotten. The book, though popular, confirmed what many had long feared. Even after 6 years and 5 Zionist congresses, Herzl remained committed to his vision of a Jewish state and his disdain for a Jewish nation. Ahad Ha'am was unsurprisingly scathing in his critique of Alt-Neuland. And I can't imagine many of the socialists, religious Zionists, or even most of the liberals were crazy about it either. Because ultimately, Ha'am's vision of Jewish nationhood is the one that prevailed. As much as the Zionist movement rallied around Herzl as an organizer, most of his ideas were never popular, and discontent with his leadership would only continue to grow. But as it entered the 20th century, Zionism faced a threat far greater than any internal squabbling. See, there's something I haven't been telling you. Zionism wasn't the only Jewish nationalist movement. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshel Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Eric Liederman, and Chris Nelson.